It's time for Football at 4. John McMullen, 97.3 ESPN. And, of course, you can check out the draft Thursday night right here on 97.3 ESPN. We bring Johnny Mack in and have a lot to discuss today as we get ready for draft night. John, what's going on, pal?
Not much. How are you, Mike?
All is well. I'm getting ready for the draft. We got a lot to dive into today. Sal Powell on earlier in the show had some interesting things to say. I'd like to get your reaction to them, and one of them, which is Howie Roseman really working the phone lines. I don't know that that's the surprise, but the intent is, hey, there's somebody that he likes trying to move up. He will move up if he has to and move back if there's nobody there. So I'll ask you with this. As we start this conversation less than a week from the draft, does it feel more and more that the Eagles do not pick at 21?
Just from Howie's history, and I've mentioned this before, in theory you would say he's not going to pick at 21. He's going to do one or the other. He's going to move up to get somebody. He's going to move down. Problem with moving down is a lot of teams want to move down in that early 20 range. I think that's the spot, the sweet spot of teams that kind of realize you're past the cusp of real first-round talents, and you know that range from say 20 to 40. You're going to get a similar level of player, and the problem when you have a situation like that is you got to have somebody who wants to come up if you want to go down. So that's the issue with that part of it. And that's kind of what Howie talked to us about this week, and the fact that you have to be ready to pick at 21 if you're forced to pick at 21. You got to have 21 people on your board you're comfortable with, the worst case scenario, so to speak, and understand if everything doesn't fall your way, if it doesn't go the way you want it to go, you got to have that plan B. They've faltered in the past. Most notably would be the Marcus Smith year, where they kind of got caught off guard, and they don't want that to happen again. And I mentioned earlier this week on the show, I think the pre-draft stuff, because of the virtual aspect of it, because of the social distancing, not everybody in the same room, I think that's more prevalent this year. People are trying to figure out the landscape, so they're ready to go on draft night for potential trades. And as far as going up, that part of it, you've seen some speculation about going way up. I don't see that happening at all. I think it would be more of a situation like last year with Andre Dillard. If a player starts to slip a little bit and they're getting close, but you know there's teams in front of you that aren't able to make it happen for that player to fall to you, then you go up. So talking 3-4 spots, not 10, 12 spots.
The quote that Sal gave us, which, the way he worded it was interesting. He said, I believe Roseman will make the pick at 21, and I believe it will be a wide receiver. Right now, they are making plays to move up if they have to, move down if they must. So move up if they have to. The have to guys would be who?
Well, the have-to guys are the top three, which have been conventional pretty much throughout this process, and that's C.D. Lamb and the two Alabama kids, Jerry Jeudy and Henry Ruggs, and then the fourth is Justin Jefferson. Ultimately, I think the Eagles are going to pick Justin Jefferson if he's there at 21. Problem is, I don't think he's going to be there at 21, and I think that's what Sal is referring to. If anything, he's a guy who's moving up the draft board as everybody gets information and understands that he's probably thought of a little bit higher than people speculated. And that's the issue. If all four of those guys are gone, then what do? Because the next group of receivers, really from 5 to 10, 11, 12 on the board, kind of similar. Yeah. And that's just what I was saying. So do you really want to take, say, Denzel Mims at 21 when maybe the 12th receiver might end up being better than him? And that's where you want to trade down, but sometimes you can't trade down. And, oh, by the way, that's where Daniel Jeremiah gets to Kenneth Murray, because look, if you're forced to stay at 21 and the receivers are gone, don't reach for a receiver. Go get a really, really good football player.
Right, and that was going to be my follow-up because he says, move up if they have to, meaning one of the three guys is someone they really like, and that's who they have to go get. Move down if they must, meaning somebody took one of the fourth or fifth guys even, and now they're at 21, and there's nobody they really like, so we must move out of that spot but that would be interesting if a Jefferson was there. You just mentioned Mims, who seems to be gaining a lot of traction. Do they stay at 21 and maybe, I don't say Jefferson would be a reach, but take a receiver that maybe is not the 21 pick in terms of value, but because that's what they really want, they just go? Or do they say, you know what, we're going to take the best player of need and then we go get a corner or a safety? So what are the scenarios that make them say we're not going to take a receiver at this pick at 21?
Well, I hope it's if those four are off the board because, as I said, I just don't think there's a fifth guy. And I almost hope, Daniel also said something on Twitter today, Daniel Jeremiah, and he said, there's not as much groupthink this year because of the lack of top 30 visits and pro days around the country. And what he meant by that is scouts sort of they're together so much. It's almost human nature to form sort of a consensus. And now everybody's off on their own. So he thinks you're going to see some surprises. And from an Eagles perspective, because I'm not a Mims guy, I think if the Eagles come out of this with Mims at 21, not that I'm not a Mims guy, I shouldn't say that. That's a bad term. I don't think there's value with that player at that pick. He might end up being a good player, but I think he belongs further down on the board is what I'm trying to say. Now, there's a speculation that, and Mike Mayock, our good friend, Philadelphia obviously native, now the Las Vegas Raiders GM, he doesn't give a flying you-know-what about public thought ever. And I think you saw that last year when the conventional wisdom, the groupthink, so to speak, was Cleveland Ferrell was going late first round. He picked him at number 4. That's how much he thought of him. And we'll see if he's right down the road. I've heard some speculation the Raiders really like Mims. And that might want to be those shocking surprises if they take him at 12. And I think that would be helpful for the Eagles to get him out of the equation. But it's and Howie uses this term all the time. It's kind of what flavor you like. It's a lot of good receivers in this draft. But if that top 4 is gone by 21, I'd rather go get one in the second round. And maybe you'll have to trade up in the second round to get comfortable. But I still think it's about value at that point. And you can get a much better player, whether it's linebacker, even safety. I don't think the corners are going to be there. They're going to go higher than expected. C.J. Henderson, A.J. Terrell, I don't think either of them are going to be there. So it starts to become a problem. And the Eagles got to make a decision. And if that decision is taking Kenneth Murray or Patrick Queen, hey, do it. Who cares if it's a linebacker?
Yeah.
Good player.
I will say if the Eagles take a linebacker, I don't think the hardcore football fan will be mad, but the average fan who thinks wide receiver is the only thing they can take, that's when the anarchy would start, right?
Yeah, to a certain degree. I mean, obviously you're going to have uneducated people saying, well, we got to have a receiver. We got to have a receiver. You don't understand how the board falls. And, you just don't take the next receiver if there's higher value elsewhere, or you shouldn't. I mean, that's where the cliche comes from. Need is the worst talent evaluator in sports. You don't just grab a player because you have a need at a certain position. And by the way, Mike, they have a bigger need at linebacker. So if you want to look at it that way, if it makes you feel better, I mean, think about this division. Ezekiel Elliott, Saquon Barkley, even in Washington, Adrian Peterson seems ageless at times, but if Darius Geis ever stays healthy in Washington, you got to deal with these running backs, and you don't have any linebackers. So you can talk about how the position is devalued, but that's going to make it tough until you get a good player at that position.
At JF McMullen, you think Andy Weidel gave you any insight on who he likes?
Well, he did at the receiver position. Obviously, he's not talking names, but he was talking about how the game has evolved, as everybody knows, and it's a spread game. It's a one-on-one game. Spread and shred is what they call it, and everybody's looking to create matchups. So if you think about it, and if it gets past that top four, then you start talking, okay, who's that type of player? Who's that type of athlete? And that's why people have focused on Mims and to a lesser extent, which I wrote about at Sports Illustrated, Brandon Ayuk, who even fits that description better, but he just had core and muscle surgery. So I do think from that perspective, that little injury concern will push him down the board, even though I think he's going to end up being a better player. So it becomes a difficult decision at that point. If those four guys aren't there, I don't want to be, and let's be honest, there's no shot C.D. Lamb or Jerry Jeudy are going to be there. There's maybe a 15% chance Ruggs would be there, and probably a 25% chance, something in that range, Jefferson will be there. And if they're all four of them aren't, I don't envy Howie Roseman. I really don't.
No, and it's like, okay, you just mentioned, it almost seems, and let me get your opinion on this, John, that Jefferson is now being clumped into that group, that there's four guys now, that Jefferson is kind of pulled out of the second group and is now more migrated towards, if you could get him, you're lucky, because he's probably not going to be their group.
Yeah, no question. Yeah, I think that's fair. A lot of people think he's above Ruggs at this point, and that's pretty shocking considering where this started. I think when it started, people had him as a second-round pick in a real deep draft class, and it's slowly risen there. And I think from the fans' perspective, I think that's in the back of their mind, and they don't understand. Well, how is this guy? He hasn't been on the field. How has he risen? And I try to explain. He hasn't risen. He hasn't risen in the NFL's mind. He's always been there. It's just in the draft Twitter mind, and the people that do the draft, they don't have all the information. As they get more information from NFL people, they realize, they think a lot more of this guy than we thought. And that's how things like that shift. So it's not like he was a bad player and all of a sudden he's a good player. I mean, he played at LSU. Obviously, that's the best team and the best conference, and he was the best playmaker and the best receiver and the guy that Joe Burrow relied upon more than anybody else. And he made play after play after play against the best teams and the biggest games. And the second part is people get caught in the fact that he played in the slot a lot at LSU, which is a spread offense. And he ran a 4.42. So just because they put him there to design plays and to get them open as best possible in their scheme, in Joe Brady's scheme, it doesn't mean he can't play other positions. The whole difficult part of the NFL draft is projection. It's not about looking at what he did. You don't say, he only played the slot at LSU, so he can only play the slot in the NFL. The Eagles run a completely different offense. They're looking at his traits as a player, and it's about projection. Now, maybe they end up being wrong. Everybody else ends up being wrong. But I think a lot of people get caught in those weeds, and they're looking, I say it all the time, they're looking back, they're not looking forward.
John McMullen at JF McMullen, 97.3. Coverage of the draft Thursday night. Of course, football at 4 got you covered here on all things that are happening. As a lot of the discussion, centers around wide receiver. We keep bringing it up, and we kind of talked about safety and corner. But I want to go to that linebacker spot because you said, hey, Kenneth Murray, How deep is the linebacker spot, and would the Eagles be in an interesting spot because of, hey, we might get carte blanche and pick whoever we want when we get to be at 21, so it's going to be hard to pass up that guy because we're going to get the best option.
Yeah, well, they can get some. Again, they are in such trouble at that position. They're going to be able to get an upgrade even in the second or third round. But the way you got to look at it is, okay, you kind of understand what you want to accomplish in the premium rounds. And if you're not able to get the receiver you want, and all of a sudden you get the best linebacker who you grade as the best linebacker, or Isaiah Simmons is obviously the top linebacker on the board, but he's more of a hybrid player. And he's kind of out of the conversation. If you're talking about a true traditional three-down linebacker, it's between Murray and Queen. And, you have your pick of the litter in theory if both of those guys fall to 21, which they might not, but it's a possibility. It's more of a possibility, I think, than any of those four receivers being there at this stage. So then you start to think to yourselves, okay, we can get the best linebacker, and we can still get a really good receiver in the second round because it's the deepest part of this class. Whereas if you reach for the receiver in the first round, you start saying, okay, what kind of linebacker can we get on the second or third round? Again, probably better than what you have, but not as good as that wide receiver. So you kind of got to juggle it that way as well.
Yeah, that would be the interesting one. Okay, let's say Jefferson's there at 21, and then there's that linebacker that's their favorite. They really like him. Do they like Jefferson enough to pass on the linebacker that they really like because they have?
Yeah, they're taking it. Yeah, they're taking Jefferson.
Okay, so
I mean, if he's there, they're taking.
Then the next guy, I guess, you're going to the fifth guy. Then, okay, do they like the fifth guy enough to take him, or do they say? That linebacker is just the best one on the board, and no one else is going to, he's the best guy, and no one else we like close to him. Let's go with him, and then we'll find out what receivers fall to us at 53.
Yeah, exactly, and that to me is the difficult decision. Do you want to push it and say, for sake of argument, and take Denzel Mims over Murray? What is your decision at that point? And personally, I would take Murray at that point because he's a better football player. Number one. Number two is the second part of what I just said. Then when you project, okay, what's deeper? If you want to end up with a wide receiver and a linebacker in rounds 1 and 2, what position is deeper in the second round? It's going to be receiver. So in theory, you would get a better receiver in the second round than linebacker, and then you end up getting the better player in the first round anyway. So that's how I would go about it, and we'll see if the Eagles are disciplined enough to think that way. But again, in between that thinking is that the Eagles would want to move down at that point before making that decision. And if they're able to move down and they can get somebody to come back up, that kind of solves their problem.
If they were to trade up, which guy is it for?
I think it would be C.D. Lamb or Jerry Jeudy, to be honest.
Judy's the one name that I feel like I haven't heard as much. Lamb's name feels like they like him. Jeudy, I feel like it's just been like out of reach. Jefferson's name has been mocked to them a lot. But Lamb is, at least it sounds like, in fact, I think Sal was on when this earlier with us and actually mentioned C.D. Lamb. He said clearly they like him a lot. But that group of guys, you're wondering which of those guys would Howie, because he got asked yesterday about giving up picks after the Slay trade, right?
Yeah, and he doesn't want to. But he also mentioned, and it's true. I mean, people kind of look at these things in a vacuum, and they're not in a vacuum. If he moves up in the first round, if he's forced to, then potentially he can move back in the second round or the third round,
right?
And gain picks back that way. So it's not just about the first-round pick, but ultimately he's been very, very consistent throughout the offseason, numerous times saying they need bodies, they need more draft picks, not less draft picks. They would have preferred their first, obviously, avenue at corner was Byron Jones in free agency. They've admitted that. It just got too expensive. They didn't want to guarantee essentially 3 years, not be able to get out of the contract for 3 years. And they had to go in a different direction and to get Slay, who ultimately I think is a better player than Byron Jones, but you have to give up 2 draft choices to get him. They didn't necessarily want to do that. So they're already behind the 8 ball as far as draft picks. 8 is better than 5, but they prefer to be back at 10. And, you know, there are other avenues to do that if you do have to go up in the draft. So I think if either of those receivers, CeeDee Lamb or Jerry Jeudy, start to slip a bit, that's when I think the Eagles start to, you know, perk up their ears and say, okay, maybe we got to go up and get one of these guys. And there was a report that really wasn't very credible that they wanted to go way up to number 10, I think, to get CeeDee Lamb, somewhere in that range. And I just can't see that, because then you're giving up really, really significant assets. And, you know, of course they like the player. I mean, most people in this league have him rated as a top receiver in such a deep draft class. But like I also said, the Eagles like Chase Young as well. Who cares? I mean, they can't get him.
The player most likely, John, if they had to include a player on draft night, the player most likely.
That's a good question. You're not going to get significant value for any player. You know, you talk about the players that potentially would be moved. You're talking about the Rasul Douglases of the world, the Sidney Joneses of the world. That's not going to get you significant assets back. That's not going to be able to make you significantly moves. Those are kind of throw-in trades, maybe player-for-player trades. When you see how the board is going and you're not getting everything you wanted. So I don't think you're looking at the Eagles throwing a player in to go up on the draft board. Those trades are more of it's the third day of the draft. We haven't gotten this position. We need this position. We got an extra corner. He's not in our plans. Let's do a player-for-player thing.
At JF McMullen, make sure you give him a follow. Sports Illustrated, 97.3 ESPN. We continue our coverage of the draft. The Eagles at 21. What will they do? 53. Don't forget, 8 picks. We'll have more on the deeper rounds and the top of the draft and more during next week's edition of Football at 4. Thanks, John. Enjoy the weekend.
All right, you too, Mike. Appreciate it.
Yeah, man. And he, like all guests, appeared via the Boardwalk Honda Hotline.